Hi, my name is Nicole Mae, and I'm a solo filmmaker. I released my first ever stop motion film a couple weeks ago, and it's called I'm Not Your Daughter, I'm Something Worse. It's about birthdays, queer family lineage, and growing older with your friends. And I made it all myself. I've been a solo filmmaker for years now, and it's not necessarily because I love doing everything alone. It's honestly because I've had to. I live in a small prairie province that has a next to nothing film industry, and I've wanted to work with companies here, but have been told over and over again that my profile is too avant-garde, too artsy and experimental. I've been told it's too personal and that in other words, film bros don't like that I haven't made an action movie. When you're queer and disabled, or really any sort of person that exists outside the margins of traditional film spaces, finding a community that gets what you're trying to do, let alone wants to help build it, isn't easy. And so I just started doing everything by myself. Storyboarding, scripting, designing, sculpting, directing, filming, animating, editing, colorizing, music engineering, and whatever else needs to be done. It's not exactly a grand act of independence. It's just that I don't want to wait for permission to tell my stories. I work with what I have. I thrift my materials and reuse old props. I also hand make a lot of things. So this time around, I did a cardboard diorama with a bunch of polymer clay sculptures. The process of building things like this really ends up feeling low budget and like you're doing it out of necessity rather than aesthetic. But I've personally come to really appreciate how much character those sorts of limitations give my work. Whenever I finish a film, I feel very reflective. I try to take notes of the things that worked really well and the things that didn't, how I can make things easier and more efficient for next time, and what I should do again. Because this was my first stop motion film, there was a lot of trial and error learning, but my biggest takeaway at the end of it all was just how patient you have to be in order to execute these sorts of films. Stop motion really forces you to slow down. It takes days to animate just a few seconds, and you have to be methodical, open to redoing everything, and observant and consistent. There's a lot of care that goes into it, and it really makes me have a new perspective on animation and stop motion. let's do Q&A. I've collected a few questions that I think can help people on their own solo filmmaking journey. The first one says, how do you fund a solo film project? And this really depends on the scale of your film. So if you are doing something that requires hired actors, permits for locations, new editing software, costumes, all of that, it is usually worth applying to microgrants. Here in Saskatchewan, we have Sask Arts, where you can apply for like $1,000, $1,500 here and there. If you remember my poetry film from a couple years ago called Brute, that one was funded. It was a part of a greater collective called Emergent. All of the artists were genderqueer from the prairies. Our exhibit was very multimedia. So I had short film, someone did music videos, another person did drawn animation. There was also a self-made video game and a live performance. So all of us together got $1,000 microgrant and then split the money accordingly. However, every other film I've made, such as this most recent one, or my other poetry film called What My Chest Says About Me, those two were fully self-funded. So as I said earlier, thrifting things, reusing props, and hand making them is really the key to reducing your budget. For the sake of this video, I've been collecting my receipts from the past 7 months of making this film. And as you can see here, I spent just under $100. The biggest expense for me was replacing the ring light I was using because it crashed and fell and broke while I was recording. It was not only my tripod, it was my source of colored lighting, so it was necessary for me to replace. And in the end, the thing that got shipped to me was different from what I actually ordered. I was sent 2 lights without the function of a tripod, and so I ended up just having to keep the old broken ring light and use the new lights in addition to it. It was a very crowded setup. Not 1 light or 2 light or 3 lights, but 4 lights for the bedroom scene. But yeah, that was about half my budget. Other than that, I was able to keep a lot of my items in and around $5 to $10. So as a whole, it felt very cost efficient for me. Another question I have here is, what gear is essential to solo filmmaking? And genuinely, nothing. My very first films were made on the free Microsoft video editor. This little thing is the only microphone I've ever owned. And although obviously a camera is a great thing to own, none of my films were actually recorded on one. I've done all of them on my phone. So I think if you're trying to prepare and gather resources, really the best way to approach it is just start with what you have, and if you can slowly add and replace your equipment for better ones, then do it at that point. But really, I want to stress that you do not have to sink yourself in a financial hole to be a solo filmmaker. Another question I have here is, what are some tips for shooting yourself in a scene? And although I didn't do this with my stop motion film, I've done it with all the rest of mine. It is not as hard as you'd think it is, but I do get a lot of questions about this. Essentially, I will use the front-facing camera. It's not as good quality, but I can improve that once I'm actually editing the film. But if it is a shot where I need it the most amount of crisp, right? I can't compromise the quality at all, then I'll just use a stool or something and place it where I'd want my body to be in the shot, and then mark that on the ground and go from there. Sometimes you have to redo shots or get multiple angles of one shot, but the more you do this and the more you put yourself in your own films, you'll start to just get a sense of the camera's visual span. Like, I just kind of know where the image will reach, horizontally, vertically, whatever. It does sort of fall into place over time. The last question says, how do you balance self-doubt with creative ambition? And honestly, self-doubt is just a part of it. I frequently hate the things I make, if I'm being really honest. I am a chronic over-editor, overanalyzer. And it can be really hard when your final product turns out much differently than you initially planned, which is a very common thing that happens. Sometimes our vision isn't actually practical, or it doesn't come across as organic as we thought it would. And it's really important to just go with the flow. Let your story unravel itself instead of just forcing the one you want. And it's really important to remember at the end of the day, it's not a big deal. You know, like, I think we can really hype up our first solo film, our first stop motion animation. But ultimately, if you're planning to do multiple films, multiple versions of one genre, your first one will be your worst. It will be your worst because you are inexperienced and likely have a lower budget and are just not at the peak of your career yet. When you see your project as so momentous and have an expectation that it has to be instantly successful, it will prevent you from creating. You might end up taking years to make it, or potentially it'll just sit as an idea forever. And that would just be so unfortunate. You know, I love seeing people being so passionate that they are just creating and creating and creating, not as a means to push or accelerate success, but because they actually want to. There is art living inside of them that they want to put out. And so, yeah, to round this back to the question, I think you just kind of have to embrace self-doubt and create anyways, and just don't see it as such a big deal. Honestly, it is a piece of you, but it will not be all of you. And so with that, we wrap up the video. Make sure to subscribe if you already haven't, like the video if you enjoyed it, leave a comment if you want to chat, and I will otherwise see you next week. Bye.